Hello and welcome to the Cloister. Today's episode is slightly different. This week I'll be sharing with you an interview I recently did with Paul Hammond over at UCB Radio. During this interview we discussed the benefits of going on a retreat and how monastic retreats came to be. I'll be back here again in 2 weeks' time, where I'll be joined by Graham Stevens, the author of our Advent devotional for 2024. We'll be discussing the devotional and also the spiritual act of pilgrimage. I hope you enjoy this interview with Paul Hammond from UCB. May it be a blessing to you.
Talking Point with Paul Hammond on UCB One.
So, a few years ago, we were down in the Cotswolds, and just because wanting something to do, I saw, those brown signs that tell us where things of local interest are. And I saw one of those, and it was pointing towards a monastery. I thought, I've never been to a monastery. I should check this out. So we drove down through these beautiful trees, lovely woodland area, drove down this little windy lane until we got to the car park. And of course, the monastery itself, it was closed off. We couldn't get access into the inner depths of it, but there were certain areas that we could just go and stand and be a part of it and enjoy the environment, enjoy the surroundings. And of course there was the obligatory gift shop as well. But whilst I was standing in the garden outside the monastery on this slightly drizzly day, surrounded by trees, there came the sound of, and I don't know whether it was Gregorian chanting or any other, but it was chanting as part of worship. And the moment of stillness that descended in my soul in that place was absolutely phenomenal. It has stayed with me. That sense of peace, that sense of God was absolutely phenomenal. As a consequence, I've always thought to myself, wouldn't it be great to be able to get away from it all and enjoy a bit of that? Well, now you can, because increasingly available to us now are monastic retreats. And joining me on the line to talk about them is David Towns. He is behind monasticretreats.co.uk. And I have to say, David, my first question is, if I go on one, do I have to wear robes? Do I get to wear robes? And do I have to keep quiet?
You don't have to wear robes at all. There will be times in the day where silence may be beneficial, but not at all. Most people that go on monastic retreats are exactly the same as you and me. We'll turn up in jeans, normally at the end of a very busy week or a very, very busy period, and we'll find that sense of peace that you've just explained.
Because there is a fair bit of stereotype still around sort of the monastic, isn't there? And the idea of the monastic. I think most people, and it's because, by definition, monasteries are cloistered away. As a result, we don't know what it's really like in there, and all sorts of assumptions play into our heads.
Absolutely. And I think the story that you shared very much echoes my own experience of going on a monastic retreat. 15 years ago, I was working for a very busy evangelical church and I found myself exhausted. And I watched a programme called The Big Silence, which was filmed at Worth Abbey in Sussex. And I just felt this kind of stirring in myself that this was a place that I could find some silence and find some peace. And I turned up and absolutely hated it. And I thought, this is ridiculous. I'm sitting here being quiet. I can't talk to anyone. I've handed my phone in. I'm kind of stuck in this kind of awkward place. And I went into the Abbey at Worth, which is a beautiful building. And I was kind of really raging against God, going, I'm really busy. I've come here for some peace and it just feels awful. And I thought, well, I'll go back, because the good thing about monasteries is they do very good food, which you don't kind of expect, but the food is always really good. So I thought, well, I'll go back to the kitchen, having been in the monastery, and get some food. And as I walked out, it had snowed and the whole place was just still. Yeah. And the snow had fallen and just the peace of God came into my heart and came into my life. And every time I've gone to a monastery, no matter what condition my heart is in, I've found that sense of peace.
Some people who have a sort of, like you alluded to, a tradition within the evangelical wing of the church may think, well, monasteries and stuff, that's more for your sort of your high church, your Catholic or your Anglo-Catholic sort of idea. It's not for us sort of, charismatic, evangelical, Pentecostal Christians. It's not really a thing for us. Yeah. I mean, there are differences in theology, aren't there, between the different wings of the church? How does that play if you go on a retreat?
So I think that there are lots of retreats that are on offer and lots of communities that offer different things. And I think you will always be able to find a monastery that will kind of link theologically to where you're at. From a personal level, I tend to go to the Benedictine monasteries. I'm not Catholic, but I think if we can kind of see past those, kind of the barriers that we put on God.
Yes.
And kind of get away. And, there's a verse in the Bible where Jesus says, come away with me. And I think that's not come away with me to a Catholic monastery. That's not come away with me to a, charismatic conference. It's just come away with me. And I think anywhere where we can find the presence of God is a place that is safe.
So tell us about monasticretreats.co.uk, because it's an interesting idea, this, and having looked through some of the retreats that are available, I mean, still for this month, although, we're heading towards the end of the month, so you might be wanting to look more into October or November, but the opportunities are very, very varied, and the environments that you would go and stay in are incredibly varied, aren't they?
Very much so. You've got some very kind of beautiful monasteries, which are very ornate, and then you've got more simplistic. Some of the Franciscan homes are very, very simple, but are still very, very beautiful. So Monastic Retreats is our web presence, which kind of came about because I was going to these monasteries and they had very few people that were attending these retreats. And then I'd kind of come home and I'd interact with other Christians who were really busy and really tired, who had no idea that this was on offer. So what I wanted to do, my history was in web design, and I wanted to kind of close that gap between these monasteries who are offering these most amazing services, these retreats, which are, so thought through and so kind of prayed over, and the people that are attending, like, how do you get those two together? So I thought, well, I've got the ability to build websites, so let's put them together. So I went to a few monasteries and said, would you let me promote some of your retreats? And they were like, absolutely, we'd love you to. And then over time, that's sort of grown. So I think we've got about 25 monasteries at the moment across the UK that share their retreats with us and allow us to share their content.
And as we've already alluded, very different in terms of what they offer, very different in terms of the style that is done. So some of them will fit into some of those stereotypes of silence and so on. Equally, if you scroll through David's website, you can come across Folk Weekend 2 Americana, where you can take your guitar along, y'all can sing some country. See, so it is very much, but what is the underpinning goal of these retreats and these spaces that you are creating, however they express themselves?
Yeah, I think when I talk to the monks, to the abbots, their whole heart behind offering these offerings is that people will find space to be still and to listen and to just be in the presence of God. And I think it was John Ortberg tells a story about some missionaries that were going on a trip, and they were working with some local indigenous people, and suddenly they just stopped, and they were they were going from one place to another place, and these indigenous people stopped, and these missionaries said, why have we stopped? And they said, because we're waiting for our souls to catch up. We've been traveling too fast. And I love that story because I think we often approach life like that. We travel so fast. We have so many commitments and so many things we do. And the heart behind all of the retreats from these monasteries is that we would slow down, that we would stop, and we would allow our souls that intentional time and space to catch up.
Just like catching our breath, really.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It is a great great website, and we've talked about retreats and we've talked about this sort of thing on the program before, and we've discussed all sorts of retreats, but for many people, accessibility to them and actually finding them is not easy, and this really does make it easy. There's explanations to what would be expected of you, explanation of what the costs are, explanations about the sort of things that will be provided at each of the retreats. Some of them will be individual guided retreats, some of them will be community based. There's everything from gardening to history to, as I said, Americana folk music. There's all sorts of things that are there. And have a look at monasticretreats.co.uk. But perhaps more importantly, out of our conversation with David this morning, maybe we should all just find a space, a time when we can let our souls catch up. David Towns, thank you very much.